everyone, this is John Daly. I'm here with Bernie Goldberg again for another episode of the No BS Zone. How's it going today, Bernie?
It's just fine so far, John. I'm on the road traveling a bit, so hence the different background. I
Right,
didn't
and
I
that
didn't pack
actually,
my I didn't pack my Emmys and to take them with me this time.
that's right. Yep, you've been doing some traveling, and because of that traveling, you haven't. We talked about this earlier. You haven't been following the news cycle as closely as you usually do, and that kind of gives us an opportunity for to change up the No BS zone a little bit today, and try an idea that I had actually pitched to you myself. Hopefully, it goes well. You were, of course, a CBS News journalist for 28 years, a correspondent for HBO for 22 years. You've covered a lot of big stories, and you also have a number of personal stories from those days. And I think members will find some of them pretty interesting. I certainly did when I first heard some of these. So that's what we're going to do today. Bertie's going to tell some stories. I outlined some that I'll be asking about, and I'm all ready to go. Bernie, if are you okay on your side to go down
I
this
just
trip down memory lane?
I just I just want to get on the record. This is John's idea. If you don't find these stories interesting, take it up with John Daly. Don't I have very little to do with this. I'm
I
not at
was
all
told.
sure you'll find my life all that interesting.
Well, I was told that Bertie's wife is on my side, so she's backing me on this. She thinks it's a good
Sure,
idea, so I think
sure.
that's in good company. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So some people may not know this. You actually helped launch the CBS News program 48 Hours that's still on. It's still running, still very popular. And you were actually on the pilot episode back in the I think it was the late 1980s. In 1990, you worked on a special report called Murder USA, and you have an interesting story to tell about that. Go ahead.
Well, we were shooting in South Central Los Angeles, and there were murders all over the place, and we had police walkie-talkies and radios, and we were getting to the murder scene seconds after the cops got there. We got to one scene, and there was a guy lying in a pool of blood. He wasn't dead at the time. I don't think he died, but he was lying in a pool of blood. And the police thought seven young black kids at the end of the street who were holed up in a triplex. They don't have high rises in South Central. So they were in a triplex and they wouldn't come out. Police didn't want to have a shootout, so they let them stay there for a while. But after about a half hour, they said, we've had enough of this. And while we had a lot of access, they wouldn't let us go down to the end of the block in case there was a shootout. They let us stay halfway up the block under a sodium vapor light. They went down with the police car, opened both doors, went behind each door, got a megaphone and said, come out with your hands up. Seven black kids, six guys and a girl come out with their hands up, lined up. And the guy with the megaphone says, go to the passenger side of the car and we're going to handcuff you. First one goes over and says, I didn't do nothing. I didn't shoot nobody. And they didn't, by the way, they didn't shoot the guy, it turns out. Said, I didn't shoot nobody. Why are you putting those ties on my arm? So they put those, what do you call those, John?
Zip
Those snap
ties.
locks, zip ties on. Then you in the yellow sweater come to the passenger side of the car. The guy goes there, he says, I didn't do nothing. I didn't shoot nobody. And they get all seven of them lined up and they march them up the street to a police wagon, single file. Halfway up the street, I'm standing with my camera crew under a sodium vapor light. There's an alert coming up. There's going to be some bad language here, folks. As they march up the street single file, one of the guys in the line who's going to the police station looks over, sees me under the sodium vapor light and says, the white hair motherfucker be on TV. To which I responded, it's nice to be recognized. And they were hauled off to the police station and then let go because they didn't shoot anybody, but I was recognized. 48 Hours was a show that was very big in prisons. Whenever we went to a prison, people would say, hey, I see you on TV all the time. So we were It was good for my ego to be recognized by a guy who was accused of almost killing somebody who thought I was the white-haired motherfucker who'd be on TV.
Yeah, that's
That's my story.
interesting.
It's absolutely true, and that's it. There's another 48-hour story that's also kind of, I hope, interesting if you want to hear that one.
Yes, I was going to say this was from the story you did called Crack Street. And to clarify, it was not about plumbers. It was actually about the drug crisis, which is a pretty scary scene. So yeah, go ahead, tell that story.
Well, it was the pilot show of 48 Hours, a program on CBS that's been on the air since the late 1980s. I mean, it's been on the air 80, 90, 30
35
some
years.
odd years.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was a pilot show, and crack was brand new at the time. And I went down to a park in Lower Manhattan. I forget the name of the park. It's near NYU, New York University. And it was a drug market. It was a drug market. So I got on the wrong side of some guy who had drugs, and he was higher than a kite. And we're rolling on this guy, and he pulled something out of his back pocket. I couldn't tell what it was, but I thought it might have been a small knife or a box cutter. And he's going like this with it, and I'm going like this, like, I mean, I don't know that the guy's going to lunge at me and cut me with the box cutter. The producer comes up in back of the camera crew and says, as producers would say, keep rolling. In other words, I may be stabbed any second now, but the producer says, keep rolling. Well, that wouldn't be terribly interesting or spectacular, except the producer was my wife and still is.
That's a
But
professional.
she
That
was,
is professional.
it turns out the guy, but oh, by the way, I asked her recently, I said, they had call boxes where you can pull a lever and the police would come. I said, you did pull, just recently, I said, you did pull the lever before you said keep rolling, right? Silence. And then she said, no. So anyway, it turns out that the guy who was going like this with what I thought may have been a knife or a box cutter was holding a bag of drugs in his hand. So that was another 48-hour story.
That's hilarious. And I think you mentioned this. I don't know if it was in a Q&A or a column a while back, but yeah, you worked together. A lot of people don't know this. You worked very closely together on a lot of stories. I think CBS even saved some money putting you in the same hotel rooms together. But yeah, that's
That's
sort of a dynamic.
that,
It's an
that,
interesting dynamic.
that's why they wanted us to work together. If I worked with another producer, that producer would get a room, I'd get a room at a fancy hotel. They didn't need to spend money for two rooms, so they got one room and they saved money that way. I think, by the way, there was one reason I didn't like or prefer not to work with my wife, although she was very good at what she did and we did good stories together. If I worked with a producer who screwed something up, I could say, you stupid son of a bitch. What the hell were you thinking when, like, you lined up an interview with me and the guy was couldn't speak English? That actually happened once, by the way. That happened. I'm talking to a guy and he starts speaking broken English and Spanish. And he said, what the hell is going on here? And I took the producer aside and I said, what the hell is wrong with you? Try doing that with your wife sometime.
Oh no, I would never do that with my wife. She is, yeah. No, that's funny. So we'll go ahead and flip over. I mentioned you were with HBO Real Sports. You did some reporting a while back from a country that we talk about a lot in the news these days, Russia. This was also during the Putin regime. He's been the guy in charge over there for quite a while now. And I believe it was, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was while you were working with on the Olympic story that you spoke with a guy named Boris on a bridge near the Kremlin. And I'm gonna go ahead and turn that over to you to tell the rest of the story.
There was a a critic of Vladimir Putin, a very charismatic critic. And that was why he was dangerous. He was attractive, very articulate, and very unafraid of speaking out against the corruption of the Putin government. And I interviewed him about the Sochi Olympics and about what he said, correctly said, all the money that was being wasted and all that. And he wrote a report. This guy was fearless. He had been in the government of Boris Yeltsin, and he was getting on Putin's nerves. He was not just some annoyance. He was a real concern. And I interviewed him walking over a bridge near the Kremlin. Several years later, he was walking over that bridge with his girlfriend. A car pulled up, guys got out and gunned him down, fired a bunch of bullets at him and killed him. They didn't kill him, and I'm not saying this because I don't want to take any responsibility, but it wasn't because of the interview that we did. It had nothing to do with that. He just wouldn't stop going after Putin. Now, Putin, of course, denies any knowledge of it. It was a bunch of Chechens who jumped out of the car. The camera had a bridge, a security camera bridge, that would have caught everything on camera. The camera was down and not working that night. What a coincidence. The security camera that would have seen everything in Russia, in the shadows of the Kremlin, wasn't working that night. Could you
Who would
believe
have
that,
thought?
John?
Yeah.
Who would
What
have
a
thought?
coincidence
Who
that
would have?
is.
Now, there's one
Yeah.
other story I'm going to be very careful about because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. I interviewed the head of the Olympic Committee after that, and he was a friend of the Russian Olympic Committee, and he was a friend of Vladimir Putin, personal friend. And I said to him, I don't remember his name. I call him Yevtuchenko. That wasn't it, but I said, Mr. Yevtuchenko, this is not me talking, but your friend, the president, Vladimir Putin, has critics who say he's acting like he's a mafia chieftain, a mafia don. What's your reaction to that? And this was a very mild-mannered guy, but he got very angry. And he said, I will not answer that question, even if you're only quoting somebody else saying it. He was very angry that somebody, the somebody was an emigre who lived in New York, a Russian emigre who lived in New York, who was a big critic of Putin and the government. He said, I will not answer it, even if you're only quoting somebody else. After the interview, I located somebody and I said, what did you think of the interview? And the person said, they're going to kill us. Yeah, easy for you to laugh, John.
Oh yeah. Oh, it is. Yeah.
And I
Gee.
actually thought they wouldn't actually kill us, right? They're not going to kill us. They're not going to kill us because I asked a question, right? But I thought about it. And I'll tell you this, I've been in some places that you don't want to go on vacation, you know, I mean, places in Haiti and stuff like that. I'm not going back to Russia.
No, I don't blame you. I don't blame you. No, and there was you had a different another story in Russia. I'm not clear if it happened on that same trip, but I find this pretty interesting. You and your news crew were actually arrested by Russian authorities doing this story. Like you said,
Right.
that would scare the crap out of me. I mean, just being this, Putin's not a big fan of journalists. We know that. Granted, you're an American journalist, a little bit different than being a Russian journalist. But can you talk about that experience? Because I find
I
that's
want,
a crazy
I want
scenario.
to, I want to, I want to make clear, we were never in any real danger. Okay, here's the story. We were shooting a broken down high-rise apartment complex that was built specifically for the Sochi Olympics. at great expense of the Russian government, which is a very poor country, by the way, Russia. People live in terrible conditions. Well, this was supposed to be for people, the Russian people after the Olympics, but it turned out to be empty. Hundreds and hundreds of apartments that were empty. So the vandals went in and broke windows and stole stuff out of the apartments, but it was just a mess. And we were shooting there to make the point that the Russians wanted to bring the Olympics to Sochi. But look at this massive apartment complex that's standing in ruins. I mean, just a dump. Well, a police car pulls up with military police and they got a gun. Chief guy has a gun on his hip. And we had a Russian translator who was a New York resident and American citizen, but had been born in Russia. Very young guy, very cool, hip guy. And the Russians told us to leave. And our translator said, "What if we don't? Are you going to shoot us?" And the Russian said, "Yes, yes." That's when our guy, who was pretty gutsy, said, they want us to follow them to a military base. I think we should follow them. So we went to the military base where they held us incommunicado for 4 or 5 hours. We couldn't use our phone. I wanted to at least call the embassy and say, if you never see us again, we're at this military base in Sochi, or near Sochi, wherever it was. And they wanted to interview people who they thought were the most important in order. And guess who was the first one they hauled into the office to interview? Right, me.
The white-haired MFer.
Yeah. So they wanted to know who told you to shoot a story there and all that. I said, I'm not cooperating with this. This is bull. And they had one officer, there was one woman in the room, and she was supposed to be the translator. I said, I don't want her translating. I want my guy translating. But at the end of this stupid interrogation, which I compared to Barney Fife interviewing somebody in Mayberry, I said to her, do you speak English? She said, yes, I speak English. I said, tell your friends, and they were all in military uniforms. I said, tell your friends over there, this is bullshit. And I walked out. Now that makes me sound like, I'm not afraid of anything. It's not true, but I wasn't afraid of them because they never held us by the way, they never held us in a prison, but the guy, we were there with a Russian independent journalist. They held in a prison. I don't even know if he's alive today because he's another guy who was an independent journalist who wouldn't stop harping on the corruption of the government. They once broke down his door while he was streaming live on the internet. He was locked into his apartment and they cut with an electric chainsaw. They cut down his apartment. That poor guy, he wasn't afraid to talk to us. I think I said to him, I said, you understand the situation you could be in. He didn't care. I don't know where he is today. I almost don't want to find out, fearing the worst. But they didn't do anything to us, but they did do something to him because he was one of them. He was seen as a traitor of sorts.
Right. Wow. So yeah, that's this is such a culture, and you're right, I don't have any interest in going there either. It's just yeah. So I wanted to go back a little bit in time before that, back to your CBS News days. So someone asked you about this a long time ago on one of the Friday Q&As. It might have been one of the first ones we did, and you talked about it a little bit, but it has to do with your old CBS News colleague Dan Rather. Many years back, before Memogate or Rathergate, whatever it's called, the false allegations that Rather reported regarding George W. Bush's National Guard service. He was in the middle of, I would call it a controversy. I don't know if I'd call it a scandal, but it was a big controversy. It surrounded a cryptic phrase, "What's the frequency, Kenneth?" Bernie, can you explain for people that don't know that story what happened and perhaps some thoughts that you and your colleagues had at the time on it?
This was in 1986. I was at CBS, as you say, at the time. And Dan was walking down the street in Manhattan. He lived in Manhattan. Just walking down the street. And a guy jumps him and beats him up. I mean, beats him up, punches him in the face and all that. And Dan said, the guy who came over and jumped me out of nowhere said, "What's the frequency, Kenneth?" I can tell you that there was suspicion in CBS News and outside of CBS News about whether the guy was a total stranger to Dan. There was a feeling with no evidence, but there was a feeling that maybe Dan did something that offended this guy someplace along the line, and the guy was getting even. But nobody would, I'll tell you this, nobody was going up to Dan and saying, "What's the real story, Dan?" Nobody was doing that.
They were
That would
afraid
have
to
been a
ask.
death. Oh. Well, it turns out that about 10 years later, a guy who's a stagehand for the Today Show on NBC is shot and killed by the same guy
Oh, wow.
that jumped Dan Rather. And the guy killed the stagehand for NBC because he was trying to figure out what kind of frequency was NBC sending to his brain. What kind of what's the frequency, right? He was trying
Okay.
to figure that out. This guy was crazier than crap. And Dan was telling the truth the whole time. So for those of you who only know the story about what's the frequency, Kenneth, and think it's a big joke, no, Dan was jumped by a lunatic who said, "What's the frequency, Kenneth?" Because he may probably recognize Dan from television and wanted to know, thought his name was Kenneth, I guess, I don't know, and wanted to know what kind of frequency Dan or Kenneth was sending to his brain or would pass for his brain. But Dan was jumped, really beaten up, and really told the whole truth about what happened.
And I don't, that's interesting because I don't know if a lot of people realize that he was sort of vindicated on that. Because I remember my parents at the time watching that, and they were convinced it was a publicity stunt for CBS News that he had
Right.
made this up. I think there was even some some video footage showing him running, but nobody chasing him, at least at that point. And yeah, they probably still think that to this day that he made it up. But no, you're right. He
Yeah,
didn't make it up.
you know why? When something dramatic happens, like an anchor man on a national newscast getting mugged and beaten up, and then the added attraction of what's the frequency, Kenneth, you almost, that sticks in your mind more than what happened later, what happened 10 years later. If you missed the story 10 years later, if you missed the news that day and you missed the story that a guy killed a stagehand at NBC and turns out it was the same guy who jumped Dan Rather, well, then you didn't know it until now, of course. So I'm
Yeah,
glad I'm doing a public service,
that's right.
clearing Dan Rather's suspicion surrounding Dan Rather.
Yeah, that was sort of a cultural, culturally significant story. I mean, we mentioned REM did a song based on that title too, and it's a good song. It's probably my favorite one by them, which is one of the few people that would say that. But yeah, it's pretty cool. But yeah, no, it's definitely one of those strange stories that really sticks around in your head. So
There's,
we wanted
there's
to.
one, there's one, yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I wanted to switch back. One more story we wanted to talk about. I had to go back to real sports. If unless you wanted to say something
Yeah,
else about the.
it's a serious story. There's nothing funny about it. But it was the last show that I was on for sports. At the end of the year, we do a year-end show, and in this particular case, it was the connection between sports and social issues like the killing of George Floyd and stuff like that. And my point in that show was that we tune in sports to get away from the daily nonstop barrage of politics. And I said this on national television. I said I tuned in to a hockey and NHL playoff game. And before the game, they had a ceremony. And one of the players said, and this is a verbatim quote, "Racism is everywhere." And I said, Brian, when I heard that, Brian Gumbel, I'm talking about, the anchor, I said, when I heard that, I changed the channel because I didn't tune into a hockey game to hear what a crummy country the United States of America is. Because if racism is everywhere, Brian, then America would in fact be a crummy country. And I don't believe it is. And Gumbel said, and this is his literal verbatim answer, well, racism is everywhere. That hit me the wrong way. There were other issues, and I was leaning to leaving anyway for other reasons. And I said, you know what? I don't want to be part of this anymore. Bill Maher, years later, not talking about this, but he came up with a phrase that fits this story. He said, some people on the left have progressophobia. They have a fear of acknowledging how much progress we've made. I understand that Black people and white people have different histories. I understand that we see the same thing often differently. I understand that. But racism is not everywhere. It's not in my house. It's not in my heart. It's not in your house. It's not in your heart. It's not in a million places, because you know, everywhere is a pretty big damn place. Pretty damn big. And racism isn't everywhere. And I just didn't want to be part of it anymore.
No,
And
I
I
think
said, a month later, I said, I'm leaving. But again, I want to emphasize, Black people and white people can see the same thing quite differently. So I'm not saying Bryant was wrong to say that. I'm saying, let's put it this way, I could understand why he might have said that, but racism isn't everywhere. I'm not backing off of that one bit.
Yeah, no, and it's still, I see on social media, a lot of people still ask about what happened there. You know, you wrote a column about it a couple years ago, or was it that long ago? But it might have been. But yeah, a lot of people are still kind of, I don't think HBO ever said anything about you leaving. I'm not even sure they've replaced you with a permanent individual yet. From what I understand, they were using different individuals, but yeah, a lot of people just still don't know. So yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting story for why you left, and I'm glad you told it.
It somehow, it's different when you write something and when you hear the person firsthand telling the story. I don't know if anybody found any of this interesting. If they didn't, again, blame John Daly.
That's
But it
right.
is
Put it
different.
all on me, everybody.
It is
That's
different to
okay.
read written words on on a computer screen than it is to hear the person involved tell it. For better or worse, it's different.
Right. Well, that's a good place to end it. I want to thank you, Bernie, for going against your instincts and doing my idea, telling your stories. Again, I find this stuff very interesting. I hope our members do as well. I know some do, just from when you've written about stories in the past, that it's usually gotten a good response. So I think people will like it. But let us know, for those watching this. Let us know in the comments section what you think. We usually do news cycle stuff, but we're always open to other ideas too. So if you have any ideas for topics for us to cover, just let us know. Anything else you'd like to add today, Bernie?
I just want to remind people, I did a video uh, about how you can give a subscription to your friends or family, or even to liberals who may not like what I write or may not like me, as hard as that is to believe.
How can that
And
be?
check out the video. John can tell you. John, where's the video?
Well, it's out on your website, bernardgoldberg.com. It's also on Bernie's social media pages, Twitter and Facebook. You can find it there. I'll probably, I do some of Bernie's social media. I'll share it out there again for everybody, but it tells you what it's about and what comes with the membership and that sort of thing.
Check out the video, please.
Great,
And
great.
and
All right.
and, and we'll see you before the end of the year. But if you're preparing for Christmas or Hanukkah, hope it's a great one.
Excellent, excellent. All right, everybody. Thanks again, Bernie, and you have a great day.
Thank you. You too, John.